Hi, everyone. My name is Carson Whitenauer, and I serve as the Executive Director for Uncommon Pursuit. I am thrilled to be here today with Veronica Frans. She is doing a PhD at Michigan State University, and it covers all kinds of topics I hardly know how to pronounce. She's studying ecology, evolution, and behavior, as well as fisheries and wildlife. And her research is engaged with questions like what does it mean that humans are part of ecological systems? And what approaches can we take to enhance the flourishing of the overall system? So my tongue is twisted into 18 different directions, but Veronica is going to break it down for us today in a very personable and clear way about why should we care for creation. And so, Veronica, welcome to the program. I'm so glad to have you on the show. And please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself and your passion for this topic.
Thank you so much, Carson. I just want to say thank you for having me here. Just it means a lot. Um, yeah, so who am I? Well, who am I without Christ, right? Like, so for me, number one, I am a lover of the Lord, and Christ is my Lord. I serve Him, and so everything I do is to glorify Him, and just I'm just honoring my calling that He has for me by caring for the creation. And so I do that as you said, it's kind of a mouthful, like as a quantitative ecologist. That's kind of the professional title I'm trying to have. And so, like the quantitative side is I work with like big data and numbers and a lot of math and just like really trying to find patterns and then the ecology side is like the study of relationships. So, ecology in general, it means that we're studying relationships between species and the environment, between species that interact with each other. And in my case, I'm looking at how humans interact with species and how species respond, whether it's directly or indirectly, through all the things that are happening around our world. And yeah, so as you said, I'm a PhD student at Michigan State University as well. But originally, I come from Spanish Harlem, New York City. So the love for the creation for me was actually through the television set when I first started off, because where I grew up, it just wasn't really possible. Yeah, we had Central Park. Okay, we did have Central Park, which is still a lovely place, but yeah, it wasn't as much until like I actually went out into the creation as a kid, and my mom like kind of she was like, "You like science? Go to camp." So that was kind of like how I started to really enjoy and observe the creation and learn about it. And so yeah, so I've traveled around the world ever since I turned 18, and I did my undergrad at Messiah University, and I studied environmental science. I worked on commercial fishing boats in Alaska for 8 years, and so like those deadliest catch people and stuff. But it was fish, not crab. But yeah, so I've done things like that and just interacted with people. And I've just studied international nature conservation from the Falkland Islands and whales to New Zealand sea lions. But also, I don't just have faith as as like one part of my life and science as another, but I really integrate it.
Hmm.
And I integrate that through just discipleship and mentoring. And I really work to equip others, young Christians who are doing the sciences or interested in science, and and yeah, so I'm vice president of Christian Women in Science, and I'm also a professor at Osable Institute of Environmental Studies, which is a Christian institute that builds up the next generation in environmental stewardship.
I don't know how you have time for it all, Veronica. It's super impressive and encouraging. You said that you actually first got your love for creation through the television set, and I'm wondering if you can just share a story or a turning point for you where your heart really began to enjoy and appreciate God's creation? What turned the switch on for you?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. So for me, I yeah, so like yeah, I was in a really small apartment and yeah, like I was just watching all of these different documentaries. Like there was this one called or some group called Creatures, and I just love people interacting with nature. And I'm probably dating myself by saying that TV show, but um, but I just really like admired people interacting with nature, you know. And I'm not that person who wants to be like a crocodile Dundee, you know, like wrestling things, but more like just really observing and like intimately knowing. And so there were a lot of opportunities for you know, underrepresented kids and just like underprivileged kids in the city. And so my mom found out about it, signed up for it, and I went to a science camp. And one of the ones I went to was at Smith College. So a lot of universities and colleges, they actually do these kinds of outreach for kids in the summertime. And yeah, so it was actually a writing class, and we were just told to take a pen and paper and to go out and observe nature. And even if it's kind of a sad story, I don't know, like for me, I really fell in love with the creation by sitting in a garden by myself as like a 11 or 12-year old, just watching a chipmunk. But it was beautiful, and writing about it, you know, writing about this chipmunk running around, going like, you know, just like looking for food, digging the way he does, like all these kinds of things. Just it just gave me this love for the creation that it was like I really loved what I was seeing and enjoyed it. And doesn't the Lord have that same delight, you know? And so for me, I feel like I had that experience, and I just keep experiencing it every time I'm out there.
That is so interesting. I actually didn't know that about you, but you know, Smith College is where both my mom and my wife went to school and graduated from. So it's always great to
Oh,
hear another Smith story, and the Smithy tribe. Uh, you know, Veronica, it's interesting too, just going back to your childhood. And for me, I grew up going hiking, and maybe every month, every other month, I would go on a camping trip with my Boy Scout troop. And so much of it just gave me this sense that this is beautiful, this is life giving, this is precious. And in particular, whenever we would happen to come across a waterfall or hike to a waterfall, I would just stand at the base of the waterfall, mesmerized that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, this waterfall was cascading down the rocks, and the sounds and the mist coming off of it, and just the grandeur of a waterfall always amazes me. And so, yeah, it's interesting for us to maybe, if you're listening, just to think about your own moment where you really came to cherish God's creation and connect with that moment again. I think sometimes we get so much into our screens, and here we are on YouTube, and we get so immersed in the busyness of life, we forget about those transcendent moments where we really fell in love with God's creation. But Veronica, we wanted to go a little bit deeper today, and it's not just that we happen to like nature, but as a Christian, you see the scriptures pointing us to value God's creation. And what scriptures do you think Christians need to pay attention to in this conversation?
oh wow, yeah. Well, you know, the first thing I want to say, right, like just like what comes to my mind right away is the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, right?
Mhm.
And so like I think sometimes we forget that. A lot of times we're really thinking about how this world serves us, or even how God serves us through the world. But everything is the Lord's, and and just knowing that it's the Lord's, we also know, like when we think about Genesis, right? I mean, just the creation of mankind. He said that we were to be made in His image, in His likeness, but also we were to be made so that we could rule over. Um, the creation, the birds in the sky, and like the fish in the sea. But even this term ruling over, people get technical about it, right? Like, I mean, I spend time with a lot of different Christians, theologians, and stuff, and it's like, there's this kind of idea of like this lordship that's very, or like dominion, that's very worldly sometimes. But actually, when we look at Christ, and Christ says, if you see me, you see the Father, right? So who he is, who his character is, he is Lord. And so he stewards us, right? We are his creation. And so in our relationship with Christ and how we see Christ's character, it is one who serves, one who restores, redeems, forgives, loves, like everything that Christ is, and we're his creation. And he's calling us in his image to do the same for his creation. Like that was our first task. That was our purpose for coming to being, right? To care for this world that's his. And so for me, I just get really like just humbled by who Christ is, and seeing and really using him as that model for how we are supposed to be stewards of the
Hmm.
creation. But also, like, I think another thing that we don't necessarily see so often is just seeing seeing how like God has said, like the most important thing, or even Jesus, I'm sorry, like, but just in the commandment, what's the greatest commandment, right? To talk about the Good Samaritan, um, and just saying, like, what is the greatest commandment is to love your neighbor, right? And in the story of the Good Samaritan, Jesus says that it, like, pretty much the Samaritan is a very unlikely person who went out of his way to care for someone else, right? And I think that when we care for the creation, especially in our interconnected world, in our world where literally everything we do, whether we're buying a cup of coffee that comes all the way from from Mexico or South Africa or Jamaica, and it's just a cup at Starbucks, to just like getting like mangoes and avocados, and I have a guilty pleasure of like loving these golden kiwis from New Zealand, and so these little things that we delight in, there's actually they actually affect others in other places. There's decisions, like our decisions that we make as consumers, our decisions that we make, like when it comes to pollutants, when it comes to just like just different ideas on sustainability, um, they affect other parts of the world. And so when I make my small decisions, I am making them out of, like, I'm trying my best to love my neighbor from really far away. And so I am an oddball, just like the Good Samaritan, because I'm thinking that far away. I'm thinking about effects that are in places that I'll never reach, the neighbors who I'll never meet. I don't know them. And even I think about when Christ said, like how easy it is to just love your own friends, right? So when he says love your enemies, I'm not saying that my neighbors are enemies, but it is very easy to love the people that I directly see who I'm impacting versus the people who I can't see that I'm impacting. So,
Hmm.
so yeah, so I love my worldly neighbors, and I think globally about the interconnections, and it makes, and so what I do every day is just out of love for that.
Wow. So, Veronica, that is what we need to unpack together because in my day to day life, I'm not nearly as aware of how my consumeristic decisions are connected to loving my neighbor. Amazon doesn't put that on their product pages. This item, will hurt your neighbor if you buy it. This item will reflect love for your neighbor. And so the dizzying amount of choices we have to make at the grocery store, or, furnishing our houses or whatever it is we're doing, uh, understanding the implications that has for our neighbors, I think is pretty daunting. And so perhaps one of the problems that we need to engage with is how this is a blind spot for individuals and for communities. But just to clarify again how strong the scriptural foundation you just gave us, I mean, we're starting about like the first page of the Bible, Genesis 1, and the first commandment that God gives is, to take care of what's mine. And you emphasized from the scriptures, God has not given up his ownership of the creation. And that means that it's a fiction for us to feel that we own this world. We are only stewards, and one day we have to give an account to the owner of the creation how well we treated what belongs to him. And then you also emphasized imitating Christ and his example of service and disadvantaging himself to advantage others. And finally, you linked this to like one of the most treasured parables of Jesus, the Good Samaritan, and invited us to imagine ourselves loving our global neighbors. And so, I mean, that's a very robust scriptural foundation. And what that means, I think, is that if Christians choose to ignore this topic, they are short-circuiting their discipleship, and we are stunting our spiritual maturity. I wanted to read a quote I found from John Stott, who you reminded me of as we were preparing for this. He wrote this book called The Radical Disciple, and in it, he has a whole section on creation care. And he writes, "It would be absurd to imagine that he who created the earth then handed it over to us to be destroyed. No, the dominion God has given us should be seen as a responsible stewardship, not a destructive dominion." And I find those words so convicting, and they just so precisely identify the heart of the matter. And so, my understanding, Veronica, is that there are some serious ecological crises, even catastrophes happening right now. And so you are all about the big data and looking at the trends, and this is your area of like professional expertise as you do a PhD on the topic. So, what are some of the data-driven observations ecologists are making right now about the different crises, the ways the God's creation is being devastated? What does that look like in today's world?
Yeah. I just want to say I am not that kind of scientist who will tell you, even though I work with numbers, I'm not that kind of scientist who's going to tell you the statistics, right? In terms of, um, like this percent and this much change. And, I'm just not at that level just yet, personally, but also like just with so much information coming in, that information will change. But the overall trend of what we see is that right now we're living in an era that's called the Anthropocene. And the Anthropocene, I think it was like in 2006 or so that someone came up with this name, but it is basically like anthropos, right? Like people. So it's this new era that we are living in, where virtually every part of the world is being affected by us humans or influenced. And so, this is like kind of an evaluation since like this industrial revolution that we had in the 1800s. And so, and not that technology is bad. Every technology, it has really advanced and helped humans in so many ways. But in many ways, it's also led us to like overusing things, just like being unsustainable. And then we also have this reliance on resources that affect our environment. So, like fossil fuels for energy, we hear a lot about climate change, right? And so, this like climate crisis that we're in, it's changed from global warming to climate change. And now we're calling it a climate crisis, right? And it's being called a climate crisis because so much is just it's just there's so many different interconnections with climate change. So we have like forest loss and like land use change, and so when we are converting our lands and intensifying agriculture and using different pollutants or different pesticides, it's affecting biodiversity. It's affecting how plants are able to just like help us to filter our air and water. And so we're going through this warming overall on our planet. We see news about wildfires happening in California, in Australia, in Amazon, extreme weather events. yeah, like we have sea ice that's melting, or we're losing sea ice in general, as well as that melting leading to sea level rise. But what I do research on is more about the biodiversity crisis, and just looking at what's happening to biodiversity. And so biodiversity is defined as the variety of life on Earth, and it is linked with a lot that's happening with climate change, because biodiversity, when we talk about life, I mean plants are life too, right? I got some plants over here. But so it's from the microbes, it's the the bacteria, the um, the different insects that we have, and the plants and the birds in the air, the pandas. Biodiversity is everything, but it's also that variety of life. And so we're actually losing species at a rate that's faster than any other rate in our human history.
Wow.
And extinctions have happened in our past, like in the past of our planet, and so we're experiencing what's called the sixth mass extinction, and that extinction is the first extinction that where humans are mostly to blame for it. And I know that this is all very overwhelming to hear, and I want to be a bearer of good news, but I think the good news is in the hope that comes despite the things that are happening. And that's how God works too, right? Like, we have prophets who kind of call out all the things that are happening to us and really like bring about these convictions to our heart. But I do want to say that as I'm listing these things, I don't want you to be so heartbroken where you're beyond like hope, because there is still hope. But I will just finish this by saying, yes, we're losing habitats. Species need spaces to be in. We're losing a diversity of habitats where you can drive down the road and everything looks the same, and that limits the kind of species that can live in those spaces. We're over harvesting, we're poaching, just taking illegally of things and polluting. There's a lot of conflicts with humans and wildlife in general, where some people just don't feel safe, so they deliberately may kill a species. And I did research on the New Zealand sea lion, and their population is recovering, but so sadly, some of some individuals have been killed or even just accidentally hit by cars, where every individual counts. Um, and so there's these kinds of things that are just happening. Uh, and yeah, it's overwhelming. But I have to say that we'll still talk about this, obviously. But I'm just listing things. But there is hope because we also have the Lord.
Yeah, and it is good to be hopeful, but I mean, part of what we want to facilitate is truthfulness and honesty, and we don't want to shoot the messenger, Veronica. We see your care and your heart, and quick to laugh and all those things. But um, I remember reading an article talking about how it used to be when you drove down the highway, when you got gas, you'd have to get your windshield cleaned because so many insects had, been hit. But now when
Mm.
you drive down the highway, your windshield usually doesn't have that problem anymore. And that's a little way of us experiencing what you've told me is called the insect apocalypse,
Ah,
that so many
yes.
insects have died off that they're not flying over the highways anymore because so many of them have been killed. And
Yeah.
it really troubles my heart to think, okay, the planet is getting hotter, uh, biodiversity is declining, extinctions are happening faster than ever before. There are more and more extreme weather events, um, and all of these trends seem to be accelerating in a negative direction. And so, you don't want to be a prophet of doom. I mean, no one likes prophets of doom, but it's also a matter of responsibility, right? If we don't clarify what's at stake, then it just gets worse and we don't change course, right? So I feel like that's a real challenge. And I feel like one of the main ways this gets pushed back on is people say that, the world just has to adjust to us. I mean, that there is this adversarial relationship. If I feel like a sea lion is going to hurt my kids, bye bye sea lion. If I feel like, either I cut down some trees in the rainforest so I can feed my family, or we starve to death, chop, chop tree. And so, a lot of people feel that, with $6, a gallon gasoline, drill, baby, drill. Like, we need more fossil fuels now because it's too expensive to drive our cars. And so I'm not endorsing this, Veronica, but just trying to bring in, and a critique people have is we can't afford it. Like, it's too costly to care for God's creation. And so, as an ecologist, you're saying, the scriptures tell us that God intended for us to dwell in harmony with his creation. And so, I want to just invite you to comment on that tension.
Yeah. Well, okay, first I want to say thank you so much, Carson, for just giving me that grace. Because like, if I could just be real for a second, like, I mean, even for me as an ecologist, I do so much research. And, like, like, it's like you just think that you're just on to the next best thing, the next best solution. And sometimes it's still so heartbreaking to see something that you're working so hard on, and then there's some news out there that just breaks your heart again. Or just, there's things happening that are just beyond what we can personally do. And it really, like, because I'm the one doing that research, I feel like maybe I do take it kind of personally sometimes. But also it's like a part of me is like, yeah, like, I don't want to be the one who's like trying to like spread all the bad news. Like, I want to also lighten hearts, because I know what it also feels like to be hurt when I hear about what's happening in the creation. And so, like, I'm just so grateful for you, because you just said, like, be honest here. And yeah, it means a lot to be able to be honest about what's happening in our world. And yeah, like, you're just it just, the way you are, it just really melts my heart. So thank you for that. um but anyway, back to your question. So yeah, I want to say that, first of all, my confidence about harmony with the creation, it does come from the Lord. And I think that that's a blessing, right? That I can build that confidence because I have the truth that comes from the Lord. And I know that because that relationship was established at the very beginning. So if we want to just talk biblically, in Genesis, we have like, when God was in this creation story, like, after everything, every component of the earth, every part of our universe, God called it good. But it wasn't until we came along that he called it very good. And I love that very good. It's like, almost like, oh, it's complete. And so for me, that gives me this kind of like hint that, hey, there's a way it's supposed to be. And so that's that harmony with nature. But scientifically speaking, putting the other hat on my head, a lot of times we, like, scientists in general, talk about how nature benefits us. First of all, we have a lot of space exploration, which is great. And it's wonderful to think we could live on Mars. And I think Mars looks pretty cool, but I really love our planet. I mean, like,
It's a
look at
special planet.
it. Yeah, it's so beautiful. I mean, if I move to Mars one day, please, like, you can watch this video and call me out for it. But in general, though, like, yeah, I just really, this is our home, and scientists know that this is our home. And so, how do you take care of your home? Like, you got to make your home a peaceful place, a comfortable place. But also, we don't want to do too much to it, right? We don't want our house to fall down. And so we think about, like, how our environment affects our health, right? So, like, the Environmental Protection Agency, I had a friend who was joking around and said it's more the People Protection Agency, because they
Right.
actually they care about, like, where pollutants are going, because it trickles down the food chain to affect us. And so a lot of times, it's more about how pollutants affect people. Or I saw something, I think it was like just the other week or something, that There was research about finding pharmaceuticals in fish, um, or microplastics. Oh my gosh, microplastics are everywhere. And so microplastics are like when plastics just break down into like little fibers, little pieces. And that has gone down the food chain, and even it can be found in our gut. So, and so we talk about how caring for the environment, we're trying to do this to care for ourselves in many ways. And it may seem selfish, right? Like, oh no, we need to care for ourselves. But actually, like, the well being of the creation and the well being of ourselves, there's actually like it could be a win win. It really can. And so I think that that's kind of where we're at, is trying to identify, well, what is the win win? Because we hear too much about what's happening to me, what's happening to me, what's happening to our planet, what's happening to our planet. And so, yeah, so that's where scientists are in general.
No, that's incredible, Veronica, because we really do need to have that. I mean, that theological basis gives us a hope. If you were just reading a website about all the environmental crises, I think it would be very depressing and discouraging, and you could start to like hate humanity for, ruining this world, and to just refresh your heart with what God says. This is how I made it. This is the purpose. This is the structure of creation. Really does lift our hearts and give us a hopefulness. And then to combine that with these teams of interdisciplinary scientists creatively using their God given imagination to think of win win solutions, I mean, that is exciting to think about. And I love calling the Environmental Protection Agency the People Protection Agency. And so many examples come to mind. I've been really distressed about the bee populations collapsing and the colony collapse disorder that's taking place in bee populations. And maybe part of it is a concern for bees, but a lot of it is a concern for honey. Where is the honey going to come from if there are no bees? And all the other foods we eat that are pollinated by bees, those are going to go away or be way more expensive. And so there are so many millions or billions of interconnections between all of these different decisions, and isolating, hey, here's how you can have the biggest impact. Here's how we as a society can move the needle. Here's the things that, would cost the least to stop doing, but would help the creation the most. I mean, getting some priorities would really help, because otherwise I just feel overwhelmed. Like, I need to move to the mountains and live in a cabin and, you know, go off the grid. Like, that seems to be the only solution here. Um, so, speaking of these win wins, can you give us a couple of examples of where scientists have discovered a win win so that there is a harmony between human flourishing and ecological flourishing?
Yeah. So, I guess like my first, well, I don't know. I guess it's not really my first real world example, but definitely the one that I've spent the longest time in. And it's in sustainable fishing, right? Like I worked in Alaska, as I said before. I worked there for 8 years, and so I've been on all kinds of boats. I was out in Kodiak on really small fishing boats for like rockfish, which you guys know them as snapper. I've done pollock, which are the kinds of fish that are on your fillet of fish sandwich from McDonald's. Like literally, they give that, And I've been doing longline fisheries for cod, which Pacific gray cod Pacific cod are that's our how you say fish and chips, right? It's like so that kind of a thing. And that was out in the Bering Sea. And yeah, it's just been, so I spent time with fishermen. I have over 800 sea days, and these fishermen who I've worked with, I mean, I don't know, definitely like over 1,000 in the 8 years I've spent time. I've just gotten to know so many personally, and they have a pride within themselves, where they say, we have one of the world's most sustainable fisheries. We feed the world, and they're just so proud of that. And I love that. And why do they even have that kind of an attitude? They see that while they're fishing, right? And so and they have that kind of an attitude because of what's called maximum sustainable yield. And so I'm going to get quantitative with you for a second, and hopefully this works out. But maximum sustainable yield is like, what can we do to take, like, how much can we take to help us flourish while we want the species to flourish too? And so a lot of times, this is really going to be technical, but a lot of times we see populations and they kind of have this arch, right, where they kind of level off, right? But the way maximum sustainable yield works is, if you level off, then you're a stable population. But now, if we want to harvest, we want to catch you while you're increasing. So we don't want you to level off, because this is like all the, it's just like, there's competition amongst other fish, all these things. Like, we want to catch you at this part of the game. And so that's how sustainable fisheries works. But it's not just, okay, so I'm going to take a certain percent. It is, we're going to watch what is happening with the population. It takes more effort, but that's where my job came in. And so I would measure fish. I would check to see, like, do they have eggs? What level are the ovaries at? I would look at these different, just like age groups. So we would take samples, what are called otoliths, which are ear bones, and they actually have rings like a tree that tell you the age of a fish, which is really cool. And so, so we get information like that. And literally, I lived and I worked with these fishermen. I'm doing these samples. I'm kind of a fish cop as well, where I'm like, hey guys, what are you doing with that, with those cigarette butts over there? You're not throwing that overboard, are you? So it's little things like that. But also, they see me doing the work, right? And so they're proud because they see me doing the assessment. That assessment goes to the government, National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. Then that data that goes into the system, and the captain can see the data in real time. And so he knows what's happening. And all of the fishermen talk to each other, but then there's a fisheries management council too. And they meet every year, and they have their own statisticians. Then they also have, like, NOAA, the government that I worked for, with our statisticians, and they talk. And so how can humans flourish in harmony with creation? By monitoring it, working together, having a say. The people who are making money off of it, and it's their livelihood, and they're feeding the world, and also the ones who are regulating, they're all working together. And so that's just one example. I don't know if I have time for another one.
No, I mean, that's a very interesting example, and the way you explain it is helpful because, again, if you have one company say, hey, we don't care about sustainable fisheries, we want to maximize profit this year, and they send out an extra 100 fishing boats and fish 24/7 and take the population down way below, that curve line, then the next year there's like 5 fish left and the whole industry is gone, right? And so, I mean, one company could come in, uh, maximize their profit and then go somewhere else the next year and a whole industry collapses. And so, I mean, to prevent that kind of predatory behavior, this whole ecosystem has sprung up to ensure the livelihood of a whole community for generations. But it's also good for the fish. And it means that there's filet of fish sandwiches at McDonald's. So, I mean, it seems like there's a way of approaching this that really is saying, okay, the fishermen need a win, the companies need a win, the people buying the fish need a win, the fish need a win, the ocean needs a win. How do we bring all of those together and know that we're achieving sustainability that's going to last for generations? I mean, that it seems like a great approach to the problem.
Yeah. I do want to say as well, actually, so there are other things that the fishermen themselves control, right? Like, so, like I remember one time where everybody was just sitting at the dock waiting for the price to go up because because the quota, they were actually given too much. The fishery was doing too well. And they were like, well, because there's supply and demand, right? So if the fishery's not doing very well, then, recently, sadly, there was an issue with king crab. And I don't know if it's like exactly that there was no king crab at all, but just that the quota was really low. And I'm sure that changed the price of king crab. So supply and demand is a whole other kind of a thing, but there's sometimes where fishermen kind of sit around and they're like, well, I'm not fishing until the price goes up. And then that's also another way where while they're waiting, like the fish are just reproducing and there's even more out there, but also they're able to still control the price in their own way. And it still works out. So it's kind of fun.
Yeah, so Veronica, help us understand that. I mean, the market sets prices for the creation, whether it's the price of a fish or a crab or a gallon of oil or a barrel of oil. How do ecologists think about identifying the value in God's creation?
Yeah. Well, so there's this thing called ecosystem services, and it's kind of interesting because now like that school of thought is changing just a little bit. Where now we're calling it nature's contributions to people, and I think it's because the mindset at first is what does the ecosystem do to serve us, and now we're thinking of it more as not just I don't know. It's just more like nature's already giving, but it's not necessarily serving, right? Um, so it's something along those lines. But basically, we put a price on things. Sadly, a lot of our politicians they work with like economic numbers, and even just like with how big our ecosystems are and such, they do tend to we just tend to put prices on things. Like money tends to be the way that we put value. So when we think about ecosystem services or nature's contributions to people, we could think about the things that nature provides for us. So like food is one of them, like the fish that I had just spoken about, and like different kinds of plants, maybe medicines, just these resources. Like we have water, we have even just oh my gosh, like fossil fuels are also what nature is giving to us. And then we think about, then there's another kind of tier about like what makes life possible for people. And so we have like pollination. You mentioned bees, right? And there's other kind of pollinators that help to make life possible, like life in general, not even human life, but like, like giving like more, how would you say, like, yeah, like pollinators, like more flowers, pollinating flowers, you're getting more seeds. So it's not just fruits that we eat, which is what nature provides for us, but it's also the life that comes from those things. We also have bacteria, right, that would decompose waste. We have soils that are also kind of, how do you say, they are storing carbon and they're just working and processing things. There's nutrients that cycle. And so there's all these kind of things that are just part of like how we observe nature's processes. Then we have like personal interactions with nature, like we interact with nature by just going out and going for a hike, or ecotourism, or even like cultural values, or like sacred spaces. Like a lot of for other religions, there are green spaces that are sacred. Like when I was in Japan, there were just some really beautiful shrines and temples that just had these gardens that were just so amazing, and they're green spaces, and so that itself has its own kind of value. So with all those things, including just the ability to support everything everywhere, like what nature does, they put numbers to it, and they kind of look at what could be gained or what could be lost from it, and how that relates to people. So filtering water, how, like, if we have if we have, oh, here's a good example. Here we go. So like mangroves, for example, I worked in Belize for a while. This was like back in like 2004 or something. I worked in Belize, but I did studies on mangroves, and there I learned that mangroves, they are like they're mostly like along coastlines and in these like kind of watery areas, but they're helpful against hurricanes. But a lot of the locals would take mangrove trees and take the wood and use it for building things. But also, people were building highways along the coastline too. And um, but because mangroves buffer against hurricanes and really help to like keep the coastline intact, what is the financial loss of cutting it down to then build a road and then go through damage from an incoming hurricane and have to reconstruct that road in the future? And so it's kind of those kinds of lessons we learn, um, where we can put value to that too.
Hmm.
I'm sure FEMA does that stuff all the time with when we try to, in hindsight, analyze some disasters that we've unfortunately been through here in the U.S. too.
Yeah, so I mean, we really need this specialty to help us recognize the value of bacteria and soils because, that's usually not what a developer of suburban homes is thinking about. But I mean, this gets us back to the win-lose approach. Uh, either I develop this subdivision and pocket some money, or the whole community benefits from a place that a species can feed on as they migrate. And, either the species can continue their migration patterns, or I can build a subdivision, make money, and provide housing. And perhaps housing is, people are priced out of houses. And so there's kind of a adversarial, like either the species migrates or we have homes to live in. Or in the rainforest. I mean, either we cut down the mangrove trees and create some goods from that and feed our families, or, next time there's a hurricane, there won't be as much of a buffer and we'll deal with it. I mean, maybe that knocks down some trees and makes them easier to get to market. And so it does still seem, Veronica, like there are a lot of situations where it's a lose win scenario. And how do we navigate those tensions?
Yeah. Um, Definitely, I see scientists are paying more attention to people, right? Like, I think a lot of times, like the whole idea of community engagement, it's so important. Like, we need to hear the people, like what's actually happening, because from the top, right? Like, I mean, like if I am just analyzing data and telling you the numbers, or even a policymaker, they just have the numbers and they don't really hear the people. It's really hard. But there's more and more scientists like me, ecologists, people who are doing conservation. They're starting to work with social scientists too, and just trying to bring in some of these social science ideas and to try to understand this the way to build bridges. Um, and I think that basically like what we how would I say it? I would say that like basically, like while we try to like listen to communities, we still aren't. We're not always going to be there, right, to get that like harmony. But I also think that we should kind of recognize what are we actually thinking of. So I think that what you're talking about is the idea of like setting aside land, right? Like preservation. And there are actually other kinds of protected areas that we can have where humans can still have from it and also receive, but there still needs to be this understanding for both. Um, and so there's actually, I don't know if you know about this, there's this initiative that's called 30 by 30.
Never
Um,
heard of it.
Okay. Well, yeah. So it's a global initiative. Well, there's 90 countries that have kind of signed on to it, but it is a goal to protect 30% of our land and 30% of our oceans by 2030. At the same time, we also have the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, where there's 17 goals that are about human flourishing, right? And only 2 of them are about life on land and life below water. And well, another one's on climate change, but everything else is about human flourishing. So we have those 2 things happening at once, and they both are trying to achieve their goals by 2030. And the UN, like, they're all on board for the Sustainable Development Goals, right? Then the 30 by 30 is like 90 countries, including the United States. But for those things, we have to be real about it. And so, like, what does it mean to really protect something? Like, what does it mean that this is an important migrating area while there's a community that is not really doing very well, and they would rather use that space to, like, I don't know, build a school,
Right.
And so yeah, I actually think that it's good that these 2 things are happening at once, because those conversations would happen. But in general, like, I would like to just say that there are things where, for example, you can have a nature reserve. Like, in the United States, we have nature reserves that are, we have nature reserves where people can only visit, right? People are kind of like kicked out otherwise. And I'm sure that they close at a certain time of day, all that. Like, we have, like, Yellowstone Park and such. But then like, in the other parts of the world, people live in protected areas, and that's okay. Those protected areas are still managed, and we can ask questions like, okay, like, my professor did research on giant pandas in China, and so panda habitat, they need forest, but there were locals who were using wood, chopping wood for fuel, and so basically, with, like, just conversations with the government, as well as conversations with people, and then also making management plans. Now they can have, like they can reduce the amount of wood that people are taking because there's subsidies. So that's something that governments can take an initiative to, right? Like, recognize the inequalities in your country and subsidize, especially if they're living in areas that you're prioritizing protection over for a certain species. But also, you can also just have a way for those people to help with restoration. So you give people jobs. There's tourism. I mean, people love pandas, so there's a lot of tourism as well, and that changes their economy too. And then there's just restoration projects that can happen at the same time. So people can take, but we can also replace, right?
Mhm.
It's not all about taking. Like, why don't we replace what we have? So yeah, so it's things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think basically what I heard is that the answer is a conversation. And it's a conversation we can all choose to participate in. And so if you're listening and perhaps you control real estate development, you can ask yourself, is this a value for me? Is this a value for my company? And what would it look like for us to develop homes for people to live in a way that's ecologically sustainable? That's a conversation we want to have because we don't want to ruin this planet. It's our home. And so if we're providing homes for people to live in, let's make sure the broader home they're situated in is also healthy. And that's it's just a conversation is what I'm hearing you say. And if that's a value we have as Christians, it's a conversation we're going to want to have. Um,
I like that.
Veronica, I want to try and get us down to something practical because these are massive issues that are in some ways outside of the scope of what I'm able to think about as I, try and raise kids and do my work and all of these things. I want to share a quote from John Green, who's very passionate about these topics. Um, he writes, "We are so much the dominant creature on this planet that we essentially decide which species live and which die, which grow in numbers like the Canada goose, and which decline like its cousin, the spoon-billed sandpiper. But as an individual, I don't feel that power. I can't decide whether a species lives or dies. I can't even get my kids to eat breakfast. And I found that to be such a refreshing quote because, as a species, as you said, we are transforming the earth in ways that are pretty devastating to it. But as individuals, I think we often feel powerless to do anything at all. And so let's say that, people watching this, or maybe just myself, I want to take this to heart. What would be some of the highest impact behavior changes I could make that would enable me to be a better steward of God's creation?
I just want to say that, like, even it's interesting because, like, that John Green quote, like, that's just like how I felt when I was telling you all the bad news, right? I was like, oh, like, and you were just like, grace, grace, Veronica, grace, grace. And I mean, but that's how it feels. It feels overwhelming. I'm an ecologist, I do research on creation care. And like, that's my goal is creation care. And yet sometimes even I feel helpless. And I think that like there is definitely like an attitude change that we can have where even if this world is so connected and we feel so overwhelmed, I think it's also just a privilege that we have that information now. Like, as this world is more and more interconnected, there's also more and more opportunities. So, so yeah, and I think that my attitude change is also just like as a Christian, right? Like I just feel like there's so many like fruits of the spirit that just come out in the way that I like lead my life. And so I could just like share with you in general, where, like, so first of all, it is like I'm following faith, right? So it's by faith that I follow my conviction to care for the creation. And, like when we are walking in faith, it is not necessarily the outcome that we're focusing on, right? It's actually that we're being faithful. We are trusting the Lord and he sees that we are faithful and our actions, will, like, the Lord will handle the rest. And so even if we don't necessarily understand what like the direct impacts of my Starbucks cup of coffee, um, like if I choose not to have a Starbucks cup of coffee, I'm not like trashing Starbucks though. I love Starbucks. It's a treat from time to time, but I don't have it every day. So if we're choosing not to do something where it's coming in a styrofoam cup or something like that, or we're bringing our own. Like I have this from a coffee shop, like if we're just bringing our own little mug somewhere and getting that refilled. Those things are just being faithful. So I don't need to know every little thing and where everything is going. I don't need to control that, but I can act in faith. So I hope that what the things I do can at least inspire you in that way. But in terms of just being practical, I would say that the first thing that I would love for people to do is just get to know the creation. My goodness, it's the Lord's. And aren't you the Lord's too? And I'm spending time getting to know myself in so many ways, but it's such a delight to just see the creation. Like as a follower of Christ, like just seeing the creation the way God sees it too, right? But also when you do it, there are apps. Like there's one called eBird and iNaturalist, where literally it can help you. There's communities of people, there's scientists as well who can use that data when you're seeing things, right, to get the status on a species. But yeah, like they'll name the animals for you. And so you're really getting to know the creation. And that's what Adam did too, right? Like he literally was naming the animals. He was like, I mean, how much more intimate with the creation could you be than to know a name?
Hmm.
And it's an honor to know the name of the things that the Lord has created. And so with that kind of relationship and that connectedness, it can also just kind of really touch your heart. And so I would really, when your heart is touched in these ways, I just want to just kind of like ask you guys to start reading labels and just get curious to know where did things actually come from. And just being curious about those things will also develop an appreciation. I'm not saying that we need to limit all the things that we enjoy, because I know that there are certain things that the Lord, like, he gives to us abundantly. But also, I think there should be just a practice of self-control. And in that self-control, like for example, with Amazon, my goodness, I had so many Amazon boxes during the pandemic. And that actually started the conviction on me, right? Like I was like, I'm not going out there. And like, so I was ordering stuff online and I realized, do I actually need this? Look at all these boxes, And so now I kind of have a new habit where, yes, I still have the Amazon app, but I'm going to leave something in my cart for like a week or even longer. Or I'll even put on my calendar, no ordering online today or this week or something like that. And just something like in that kind of way. And just, it teaches me to just look back and say, do I really need that? And I think about that, especially when it comes to plastics more and more, they convict me. And I think that, one of the fruits of spirits is humility.
Hmm.
And I grew up in New York City, okay? So when we would pollute, we would say we were, okay, please nobody cancel me for this. Oh my gosh. But we would say, and I was 10 at the time, that we were helping the poor by not recycling because it was like 5 cents a can, 5 cents a bottle, and so we can help them to work for themselves. That's horrible. That's horrible. Because wow, like that was not a Christ-like attitude, and I was young, and our family, we didn't learn much about creation care until I was the one getting older and leading the way. But at the same time, like, yeah, now I pick up the bottles, I pick up the cans. And and for me, I'm not going to leave it for someone else because they may need that 5 cents. Like it's actually because I'm caring for the creation. I'm not going to put the responsibility. God's called me. God called me to walk on that street and see that piece of trash. So just as how Jesus humbled himself to wash the feet of his disciples, why can we not humble ourselves and get on our knees and just pick up something that, like even a trash bag blowing in the wind? The last thing I'll say, because oh my gosh, my list can be so long, but it's just the things that I do, right? I want to tell you what I do because I feel like, how can I talk about all the other things that people do if it's, like I need to live that life myself, right? And so I'm on that journey too. And so I got into community sustained agriculture. Um, and I'm a student, and so I have a student budget, and but actually it's been really helpful for me, especially as like prices are rising with food and everything. um, but for every season, I pay a certain amount, and then there's different farmers, and these are students who are learning how to do organic farming. So I'm actually helping to fund these students who are doing the work, right? And they're learning about farming, and I get to talk to ranchers and everything, and I get a new harvest every week. And it's a conversation with them too that's amazing. There's grace there. We're getting to know each other. And so I'm not just picking up my food like I go to the grocery store and go away, but I have this intimate relationship with the people who are tilling the soil. And I absolutely love that. And it's even a chance to speak the gospel, right? With interactions. And there's some agriculture things where you can even be on a community farm yourself. But there's so much we can do. And I know that there's also a cost, right? When you look at labels and all that. But I also find that if I just find joy in the things I already have, there's so much that I see that the Lord has given me. And I also know, like in Luke, he talks about, the more you're given, the more responsibility. And so I really embrace that. I embrace that beyond just consumerism. I embrace that in other ways too. And even like when I see gifts, I try to buy gifts that may be sustainable, where maybe it was a project where they empowered women. And so it's a piece of jewelry made from another country. And even if it traveled far, I know that I'm supporting a cause. So it's just things like that where I really try to be conscious of the gifts that God gives me and that I'm able to enjoy. And it teaches me patience, right? To just wait. And yeah.
So,
I can really go on,
Veronica,
but I'll calm
this is
down.
great. No, I mean, I think usually what I hear in response to this is like, turn off the lights in your house, install solar panels, um, things like this, make your own clothes. And it's like, I don't know, it just feels very legalistic. And that's not the kind of person I want to become. But the way you put that answer, I was learning as you were talking. And to me, what I heard is embrace the gift of enjoying God's creation, embrace the fruit of the Spirit. Embrace gratitude for all that God has given to you and enjoy what you already have. Um, experience the freedom of a simple life, a content life, and don't get caught up in a consumeristic buy, mentality, which often leads to not just environmental waste, but regret, debt, all kinds of, other things that we don't always account for when we hit the purchase button. And I heard you talk about relationships and enjoying community and, becoming a more patient and humble person and having a lifestyle of looking to serve. And this all feels to me like becoming the people God called us to be. And
Mm.
so I see everything you're talking about as being an invitation into a fuller life as a disciple of Jesus. And that is a journey that, you have emphasized over and over again is one of grace and is one of joy. And wow, what a conversation changer that is in the midst of, uh, like 18 different interlocking, like ecological catastrophes. For Christians to embody these virtues with joy and pleasure as we commune with our loving God, um, that is such a distinctive witness. The final question I wanted to ask you, Veronica, is how this all ties together when people shaped like this by God's grace come together in their local church. We have a collective responsibility as a church body. And so, what would be your advice to a church community that is bursting with joy for God's creation and has an outpost of heaven to demonstrate care for creation? What does that look like for a whole church to engage with this?
Yeah. Well, if I could just take 1 second, because I was doing a devotional this weekend, and and part of my devotional had me reading the book of John. So I was reading the book of John, and I mean, I was really surprised. So I was reading John 17, and in John 17, Jesus is praying for his disciples, and this is what after he's speaking with his disciples, and they have this revelation really of they're finally receiving it. They are understanding who Jesus is, that he is the Son of Man, and he's the Son of God. And this is before he goes to the garden. All right. And so when I was reading this, I'm like, oh wow, he's praying for his disciples' protection. And then in verse 20, I realized Jesus is praying for us. And so I just want to read really quick. But he says, I am praying not only for these disciples, but also for all who will ever believe in me through their message. I pray that they will all be one, just as you and I are one, as you are in me, Father, and I am in you. And may they be in us, so that the world will believe you sent me. And for me, I was like, oh my gosh. First of all, I was amazed. I was like, I know Jesus prayed for us, right? He had all his years, like, he was praying for us, I'm sure.
It's had time.
But he definitely, yeah, he had time. But John allowed us to witness, to hear Jesus praying for me. He prayed for us as the church, for those who will believe in him. And he prayed especially that we will all be one. And for me, I just want to say, if the church, if anybody who's listening to this was going to take away a message, I think that caring for the creation is one of those things where I just really wish that we could be one. And like, we're called to be one. What does that mean, right? Like, I mean, the Trinity is a covenant. And so, like, it's just like everything is together. And I just, in so many ways, the church can be one. And I hope that one day we will be one when it comes to caring for creation, which was our very first call as beings when God gave us life. But anyway, so that's me preaching. But I just want to say, like, there's three major things that the church can do. And it all has to do with community. And so the first thing is to enjoy the creation together. And the second would be to praise the Lord for the creation together. And then the third would be to care for creation together. And so how would you do that? So, like, enjoying the creation together would be, for example, just planning a walk somewhere. You know, like, how many times are we doing a devotional? We come together for Bible study. Like, why can't we just have a mini walk before Bible study? That's part of community. And also, if you, like, there's different kinds of personalities where sometimes people don't really feel comfortable sitting in a room, just in a circle talking to each other. But if you have something that can distract you, like walking in nature, those kinds of things, and not actually making eye contact, that can actually be more comfortable for some people for conversations while you're still enjoying the creation. And it's healthy for you. But then also a morning fellowship, right? I mean, some of us just don't want to get out of bed before church, right? I was like, who goes to the 9 a.m. service? No, but I mean, but bird watching, if you had bird watching, that's like a 6 a.m. service. But still, I think that it would be refreshing, right? To offer maybe once a month a morning fellowship before church or some other day to just go bird watching. You know, so much of the scriptures talk about looking at the birds and how they depend on the Lord. And there's so much we can learn from that. And so it would just be great. But just also like observing and reflecting together, like how many truths when you're talking together and learning about the creation, like how many truths about Christ's character can really come out when you're observing together, just, you know, 2 or 3 people in the Lord. And yeah, and it's summertime, right? Vacation Bible school. Like, why not go on different trips out in the creation, go to a museum, an aquarium, go on a tour, like help the next generation to fall in love with the creation too. And I know we talk a lot about all these devices and all the distractions, but a lot of times I feel like, you know, the creation's a beautiful distraction, and it is healthy for you. And I think it can help in many ways. The other thing, so I said the second one was like praising the Lord for the creation. So there are worship songs that we can kind of just like, you know, turn up the beat a little bit. But there are worship songs out there that really glorify the creation. So why not have a creation theme or just kind of sneak it in every once in a while? Yeah, like Climate Vigil is something, there's a thing called climatevigil.org. But Porter's Gate, they just recently, 2 weeks ago, they came out with an album that's all about the creation, and their worship songs, and they're lovely. You could even have a sermon on creation care. Like, I mean, oh, wow, like, I love talking to pastors. I don't know how many pastors I talk to, but hey, like, if you want to have a chat, we could totally have a chat. But let's bring the creation into regular sermons. Like Job said, let's like observe. Like, I mean, I know this is probably while Job was kind of going through a couple of his bad times, but he still was saying, hey, why don't you check the birds? They will tell you. Why don't you look at the earth and they will speak to you? They will tell you what the Lord does and how he is. Yeah. And then, yeah, in terms of caring, right? I know you said solar panels. I will say this personally. I think solar panels, for me, like at my mom's home that she lives in, it would be very expensive for her. But if churches are, you know, a community, and so if a big church building had solar panels, even if it's the church that's getting that energy, they're actually feeding that if they're connected to the grid, they're actually feeding that energy back into the grid, and then that goes into the community. And so it's not even necessarily that church members are getting that sustainable energy, but it still helps to do a lot of offsets, or even recycling. Like my mom, she can't. She's like, the recycling is getting more and more expensive, right? If you had to choose between paying for your trash to get taken or your recycling, obviously the stinky stuff is gonna be the priority. But yeah, I mean, there are a lot of places here in the U.S. where we still need to pay for that recycling service. And so if a church were to host a big recycling bin in their parking lot, then maybe the community, like the church members with their tithes and offerings, that can really help pay. And then that, and help others to be able to afford to care for creation.
Hmm.
Native plants are another one, right? Like planting native plants and learning about your local plants or bird feeders at your church. Yeah, just so many things. Or even, as I said, about just humbling ourselves and picking up plastic. Like, why not go on a service trip for a beach cleanup or cleaning up a park? And I think that if we were to volunteer as church members in these kinds of things that are happening in our communities, how is that not an opportunity to speak the gospel?
Hmm.
I mean, and to just be witnesses as like followers of Christ and caring for the creation. So yeah.
No, that's so great, Veronica. And I mean, all of these things tied together. I imagine, a small group going to a local park to clean it up, and that leading to conversations with people saying, "Why are you here cleaning up the park?" And to say, "Well, we worship a God who made this park and loves it, and He's asked us to steward it, and so we wanted to take care of His creation." And people just being absolutely befuddled that there are people who think and live that way, and the conversations that could lead to about the gospel. And so, even if your heart is for traditional church things like evangelism or community building, uh, there's a richer imagination that you're giving to us as a quantitative ecologist that is opening up our hearts and our minds to just see a bigger picture of what it looks like to know a God who's a creator. I mean, that's part of God's identity as creator, and to experience that as a gift in our daily lives and in our worshiping communities. So,
Um,
Veronica, this is so much to digest. Where can we go if we wanted to like keep learning about this? Any final like, hey, here's some trusted resources that or communities or websites or books that you would recommend to us?
yeah, I do want to say really quick the whole thing
Yeah.
about community as well. What's great is I am an ecologist, right? And I'm seeing more and more how the Lord uses that, like my knowledge of ecology, and just seeing how He works, right? And I'm really understanding because this idea of community, fellowship, everybody having their part, like ecology is a study of interactions and it is a community, and that everyone does have that part. And so I see it now. Like I see what the Lord means when He talks about the importance of everyone having their part in the church, everyone having their part in creation care. So yeah, so it's just really exciting. But okay, so in terms of resources, so I had mentioned before this climatevigil.org. It is a really cool website. It is a movement in terms of climate change and just really trying to get the church to just pray for the creation, to praise the Lord for the creation. And I believe it's in September where they want to kind of host like special vigils where people are just really acknowledging and like experiencing like lament over what's happening. But
Hmm.
they also have a source of information about like different, like there's a link in there where they have uh, different perspectives as well across different denominations, which is really interesting to see how other people, other groups among us Christians are interpreting creation care. And in terms of just discipleship in general, I really do recommend John Stott. And so for me, he's my favorite theologian, honestly, because I just really love the way he speaks. And he is a lover of creation too. And so this book is called The Birds, Our Teachers. And he has done what God says too, right? Like watch the birds, see the birds, and what they do. And he gives different examples of from his own observations and how that relates to Scripture and God's character. And I think it would give us a mindset to really observe the creation. Another one is 50 Ways to Help Save the Earth. And this book is for a church, and they have a website which I wasn't aware of before. I should have checked. But yeah, they just talk about like how we can help save the earth as a church community. Um, and then I mean, there are so many things like even my own stuff. Like I've been interviewed before with BioLogos. They had a creation care summit, but their materials I don't think they're all out yet. And even just, I wrote an article about coexisting with wildlife. I mean, there's so much stuff out there. Um, but definitely, I just encourage everyone to just, like, let's first just really take a moment to acknowledge him. And yeah, just when you're reading scripture, notice how much the Lord just uses the rest of the creation as his example, and just see how much it matters to him. So it should matter to us too.
Wow. Veronica, I love that. Bringing us back to the scriptures and to worship again and again and again. It's so obvious that's your heart. And thank you for those resources. I'll put links to those in the Uncommon Pursuit community. And if you have watched this far and you would like to engage with an international community of people who are processing what it means to follow Jesus and to engage with creation care, I would love to invite you to get involved with the Uncommon Pursuit community. And so, Veronica, thank you for being on the program today and for sharing your heart with us and all of your wisdom from years and years and years of field experience and academic study. It has been a joy to engage with you, and I just feel a fuller and bigger sense of what it means to be a disciple today. And so, thank you for that. Um, well, that's it for today's show. Thank you so much for watching, and we hope to see you again in the future.